the fabulous David Schmidt. David Schmidt, we're lucky he's here too. Oh, I can see you've got fans, David, nice. Yeah, go ahead, cheer, clap. Yeah, we're all fine with that. David spends half of his time in Mexico, and so when he's here for the other half of the time, we like to have him come and tell stories. David is a really interesting guy. He's a writer, he's a translator, and he's a musician, and he's a storyteller. He's brought along his guitar, and he's brought along a story, so please welcome David Schmidt.
I left my baby lying there. I left my baby lying there. I left my baby lying there to go and gather blaeberries. Hovan, hovan, horia, ho. Hovan, hovan, horia, ho. Hovan, hovan, horia, ho. I never found my baby. I saw the swan upon the lake. I saw the swan upon the lake. I saw the swan upon the lake, but never saw my baby. I heard the curlew crying far. I heard the curlew crying far. I heard the curlew crying far, but never heard my baby. I searched the moorlands and then wandered through the silent glens. I saw the mist upon the ben, but never saw my baby. Oh, hovan, hovan, horia, ho. Hovan, hovan, horia, ho. Hovan, hovan, horia, ho. I never found my baby. Oh. This is the tale, thank you. This is the tale of the Changeling. An old tale collected by Lady Wilde, the mother of Oscar Wilde. My adaptation of it. So Mary and her husband Liam, they lay in bed. They lived in just a one-room cottage out on the moors. And they lay in bed, and it was one of those nights the wind was howling outside, and for some reason Mary, she just couldn't get to sleep. She was laying there, sort of staring nearby. There's the cradle where their baby's sleeping, and just sort of staring at the fire, those embers that are crackling. She was laying there, something just didn't feel right. Felt like there was something out there, something otherworldly on this night. And as she lay there looking at her baby, the door suddenly blew open with a gust of wind. Two people walked in. There was a tall, gaunt, dark man wearing a tall hat. She couldn't see his face, but there was something sinister in the way he looked, the way he walked. He walked like somebody trying to walk backwards. Like he wasn't even comfortable in his own skin, like something else was inside his skin. He was followed by this old lady hunched over, and the lady, she was carrying a baby all bundled up. Mary saw them walk in. She's just, first thing she thought was they're wandering out somewhere and they were lost and they just want to come warm themselves by the fire. That's fine. But they didn't sit by the fire. They went to the opposite corner of the hut, as far away from the fire as they could get. And they went over, they just sat over there in the corner in the darkness. And they sat there, and that old woman, She just stared at the cradle where Mary's baby was sleeping. She wouldn't take her eyes off of that cradle. Mary called out to them. They didn't answer. So she lit a candle to see them better. She lit up a candle, and the old woman, clear from the other side of the cottage, the woman went, and that candle blew out. Mary, she lit a second candle again. That woman blew it out from all the way the opposite side of the cottage. She lit it up a third time, and this time a gust of wind blew in, the door slammed open, and it blew out the fire, and it blew out the candle, and it was just darkness. And Mary heard this peal of laughter, cackling, nasty, sinister laughter filled the cottage. Well, that woke Liam up too, and so Liam, he lit a candle and went over to start the fire up again and went over there, and then they both heard from the crib the shrieking, only it wasn't anything like a sound their baby had ever made. It wasn't a normal baby's crying. It almost sounded like a wild animal when it's caught in a trap. And they went and they looked into that crib, and they saw the ugliest creature they'd ever seen. This creature lying there, something like a baby, sort of like a baby, but it was covered in hair. It had long, sharp teeth, and it would lay there grinning at them, this hideous smile. And then they knew what had happened. Those two strange people who had come in from the night, those were the fae folk, the fairy folk. And they had brought a changeling. Now everyone knows that the fae folk, they do this sometimes. For whatever reason, they covet our human babies, and so they will come and they'll take our babies, like that song I sing talks about. They take our babies and sometimes they leave one in its place, one of their own kind. And that changeling just lay there all covered in hair, shrieking like an animal. Well, Mary and Liam, they went out onto the porch and they just stood there in the wind, and they stood there holding each other, just hugging each other and weeping for the loss of their child. The wind's whipping their clothes about. Hello? Look at this young lady. She seemed to have just come out of nowhere. Young lady wearing a red kerchief on her head. Hello? What's wrong? Well, they didn't hear her approach, but they told her what had happened, and they brought her inside, and they brought her over to that crib, and they pointed at that horrible thing. But the lady, she leaned over, and when she saw that, she laughed, and she smiled. They said, "What are you doing? Why are you laughing at this horrible thing?" She said, "No, you don't understand." She reached, she picked it up, she cradled it. "This is my child. I'm one of the fae folk. I know it was my people who did this to you. This is my child. He may look ugly to you, but he's beautiful to me. I love him more than anything. I'd do anything to get him back, and I'm sure your people, your folk, feel the same way that we do about ours." They tried to change him, but I'll help you change him back. I'll tell you how to get your child back. Because I know my people and I know our weaknesses, so here's what you do. Tomorrow you go out to the fairy fort. Everyone knows where the fairy forts are, wherever they live. It's well known that that's the fairies. Sometimes they're invisible, sometimes they're not, but they live inside these mounds on the ground. She told them, the fairy fort, go out there, you go there and you bring 3 sheaves of corn, 3 corn husks, 3 sheaves of corn, and bring some fire. Bring a torch, and you go out there and you light up those sheaves of corn. You're going to see an old man. He's our king. He's the leader. You'll see an old man appear. And when he appears, you tell him to give your child back, or else you're going to burn down the fairy fort, burn down our home. That's the only way to get your child back. So they did. She took her child, she walked off, and then she seemed to just sort of disappear again. They didn't even see where she went. Well, so the next day, it was a cloudy, dark day, sort of drizzling, but they brought a strong torch. They brought those 3 sheaves of corn. And they went out to that fairy fort. Now, to you and me, it would just look like sort of a mound, almost like this mound right here. Sort of an irregular, but something not natural, something made by hands, human-like hands. And they went to that mound, that fairy fort. It's covered with rocks and trees and brush. And so they walked out there, and Liam, he took those sheaves, he took the first one and he lit it on fire with a torch. And he held it out just real briefly, for just a second or two. In the smoke, in the fire of that, they saw this craggy old man's face appeared in the smoke, and then it disappeared again. So he lit up a second sheave, and that man's face, it became more solid this time. And the man looked and sneered at them. He said, "What do you want?" and said, "Give me back my son!" And the man disappeared. So then he picked up the third one. He held up that torch. He didn't see anyone, but he called out to that fort. He said, "Whoever's in there, I'm lighting the third sheath right now. I'm about to light it. If you don't give me my son back, I will smash every rock on this fort. I'll light fire in every tree here. There'll be no place for your people to shelter and dance your fairy dances. You'll have no home." And he lit that sheath, and that old man appeared, holding the baby this time. The old man said, "Here, take him." He thrust the baby into their arms, and he disappeared. Well, they took their baby back home. They looked, sure enough, it was him. So they took him back home. And once they got back home, now they understood the weakness of the fey folk, of the fairy folk, is fire and iron, too. Iron. These are two things you should all know if you ever run into these folks. Because that's true. So they got back home and they took a coal from the fire and they drew a circle around the baby's crib with that protection of the fire. Then they took a horseshoe nail and they hung that around his neck day and night, that iron and the fire. And it worked. It protected that baby. Now the fairies, they never came back for him again. They left him alone, and he grew up to be a strong young man. But ever since then, Liam, he made sure that nobody touched a single stone on that fairy fort. He saw to it that nobody ever harassed the fairies, nobody could touch a stone or cut a tree from there. And those fairies, they continued to dance on top of that fairy fort at night. And they still dance there to this day. And if you go out there, you can see them dancing too. And you can hear them singing. Ho van ho van horia ho, ho van ho van horia ho, ho van horia ho. I never found my baby. Oh. The Changeling by Lady Wilde. Thank you.